Good evening all and welcome. This festive season, I wanted to bring back one of my all-time favorite topics, black-eyed kids. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Firstly, I would like to state that I am an atheist and tend to remain skeptical when it comes to the supernatural or paranormal events. But there have been a handful of events that have occurred in my life that science and rational thought can't explain. One such event occurred in July of 2017. For context, I was then a 23-year-old man, originally from the north of England, but now currently living in the West Midlands. During the event of this experience, I was house-sitting with my boyfriend. The people who owned it had quite a large amount of land, and were in the middle of nowhere. And by nowhere, I mean the middle of the forest, on the top of hills and surrounded by mountains and caves. Our friend and her husband had gone on holiday, but due to having quite a lot of land and a very large and ostentatious home, and a lot of animals to look after, I didn't mind. I'd already lived in the countryside, and because of my boyfriend's work, I usually am home alone, so I don't mind the isolation all that much. I imagined it would be fun to explore the woods, play with the animals on the farm, and even go explore the caves nearby as they're full of ruins, and cave houses that were built during the Bronze Age or something. We were staying in the guest house and were tasked with making sure the gardens were looked after. The yards were kept clean, the house itself was secure, and that the 6 horses, 5 geese, and 2 farm cats were still all looked after. Despite it being lots of work, cleaning up after the horses and just generally looking after the place, we were enjoying ourselves, taking time to swim in the pool and binge watch Stranger Things on Netflix. However, at the time my boyfriend had been recently promoted and was unfortunately called into work for the last few days of the week. He tried to make sure that he helped me with all the jobs before he left in the afternoon. But on Friday, I had to do the afternoon chores all by myself, so after feeding the horses I put the geese back in their shed, making sure they had water and food, when I noticed the 2 farm cats acting very strange. Harry and Jack, despite being tough farm cats, had the nicest disposition ever. They were really friendly. But now they were standing by one of the big gates on the yard, hissing at the bolted and locked wooden gate. Then suddenly they stopped hissing and climbed back into their little wooden house, seemingly for the night. After locking the geese in their hut and making sure it was secured against the foxes, I went over to the big yard gate. I tried to peep through this massive barbed wire gate to see if there was anyone outside. But there was nothing there. In truth, I didn't expect to see anyone, because the house itself was in the middle of the forest and hills. Pretty much, I was in the middle of nowhere, and the nearest village was a 20-minute drive away. I just chalked the cat's odd behavior to a naughty fox trying to sneak in, but I couldn't help feeling a little freaked out. After giving the cats food and water, I locked them in their cool little cat house to make sure they wouldn't be brawling with the local foxes or other wildlife. And once I did that, I did one last check of the horses in their fields. So I hiked up the hills, and whilst checking on the 2 mares, I got this odd sensation, like someone watching me. I would have chalked it up to paranoia, but suddenly the 2 mares let out a shrill-like cry and bolted. I felt both confused and worried, as the normally very placid mares rushed out of the field and hid inside their shelter. If that wasn't weird enough, things only grew more troubling. When I made my way back down through the fields, I discovered all the horses were doing the same. The big, boisterous stallion Saxon was hiding within his field shelter, and the little family, a trio of horses comprised of a mare, foal and male horse, had also taken to hiding in their shelter at the far end of the field. This was really weird. I'd spent every hour of the day for a week observing these animals and looking after them, and they hadn't acted like this before. I even considered calling my boyfriend back, but couldn't help the feeling like I was overreacting. As I finished tidying up the yard, I switched on the electric fences and made my way back to the guest house. It was getting cold, and it was somewhat soothing. We had experienced a week of scorching Spanish weather, so a little breeze and shade was actually quite soothing. But the breeze turned to gale, and the grey clouds above me went black as night. I remember feeling really strange as I looked up at the suddenly tempestuous skies. Suddenly the heavens unleashed, and I rushed off down the garden path back to the guest house, which was situated next to the electronic gate and just across from the main house. I suddenly felt a lot safer, and then I thought to myself, safer? Safe from what? I had no idea why I was freaking out so much. I told myself to stop being stupid and kept telling myself people of my age shouldn't be getting worked up over nothing. So I opened the guest house door and proceeded to tidy up the wheelbarrows away and lock up the garage, which was handily connected to the side of the guest house, with its roof sheltering me from the rain. Then, a rather nasty wind whipped down through the path leading up to the garden, startling not just me, but all the birds who were nesting in the bushes at the time. Their unexpected and frantic screeching was enough for me. I slammed the garage door shut, locking it quickly, and scrambled back into the guest house. Now, all the time we'd been staying there, we had never locked the door to the guest house. I guess we felt safe behind the high walls and electronic gates. I see now that we were foolish to think so. Yet something about tonight made me want to lock that door. Perhaps it was because of the weather or the strange behavior of the animals, or maybe it was the notion that my boyfriend, the only person who knows I'm out here and could help me, wouldn't be back until 3 a.m. Regardless, something about tonight made me feel like that simple wooden door and its easily smashable glass window were all the protection I had. So I locked the door from the inside and kept the keys in my pocket. Sitting down on the sofa, I turned on the TV and began to watch my favorite soap opera to take my mind off my irrational fears. However, every now and again, my eyes would veer away from the television and gaze out of the 3 very large windows. Looking out across the gravelly front yard and the distant rain-drenched garden, I didn't know why I kept looking out the window, but in hindsight, I think it was my instincts telling me to do so, to keep a watch, because something was coming. Evening turned to night, and I let out a tired yawn as I watched the lights around the yard automatically come on. I looked out down past the kitchen and out the glass on the door to see a patio light turn on just as it always had done. I know it might seem silly, but the idea of feeling surrounded by light made me feel safe. Nothing can hide in the light, and it seemed like light was able to banish all the bad things, all the bogeymen in closets, all the monsters under the bed. It could even get rid of nightmares, and now I was safe surrounded by my lights. How foolish of me. A loud knock at that moment rapped on the guest house door, almost causing me to jump out my skin. I looked over to the door, but the patio light had gone out, and it made it difficult to see anything. Feeling really frightened, I turned the television off and looked out the living room window to check that the electronic gates were still shut, which they were. I kept thinking maybe my imagination had gotten the best of me, and that my fear had just made me believe I had heard the knock at the door. However, any doubt I had was washed away as a second, more firmer knock rattled across the glass on the door. Utter disbelief took hold, and I could feel myself leave my body. That's how shocked I was. I mean, this isn't a street in the middle of an estate. This was in the middle of nowhere. For a moment I sat there listening to the rain drumming on the window of the guest house, and with a deep breath I stood up, stepping towards the kitchen and the front door. To my shock and surprise, on the other side of the glass on the door were 2 young boys, They looked about 12 to 14, and the dark hoodies that they wore were sodden from the rain, as if they had been standing there the entire night. They looked pale and cold, and a surge of humanity and compassion swept over me, causing me to almost make a massive mistake. I rushed over to the door and went to open it, fearing that the children may be injured or lost. But then it suddenly dawned on me. Where did they come from? And how did they get in without me opening the electronic gate? I withdrew my hand from opening the door, and the two boys looked up towards me from behind the glass, with most of their faces still shrouded behind their hoods. "Please, let us in. We went for a walk and got lost in the woods." The taller and more mature of the boys spoke. His words seemed more calculating and smooth than what a child's ought to be. "We're cold and lost and scared," whimpered the smaller boy. His words pulled on my heartstrings, and I did really feel worried for them. But then once again, I reminded myself this wasn't possible, so when I summed up all my courage in my breath, I asked the two children a question. "Where did you come from? How did you get in here?" "The gate was open. We saw the lights were on and rushed over. Please, can we come in and out of the cold? We just want to call our parents. They'd be worried sick," the taller boy exclaimed, with his well-composed words luring me towards the door. Again, I found myself believing the words of the more mature boy, and I almost believed his explanation, before I suddenly realized that the gates had been closed since my boyfriend had left. Only we were in possession of the remotes used to open the gates, and I knew I hadn't opened them. "You're lying. The gate's been shut all night. I never saw you come in, so where did you come from?" I called out, my words trembling as I spoke. The two young boys looked at each other, and what happened next sent a shiver down my spine. They turned their heads to look behind them, and there down the garden path was an even taller boy, emerging from the darkness. His long, slender form seemed to drift through the bushes and trees that hung over the little pathway. Like the others, he was wearing a dark hood, and his spindly hands were cold white. What little I could see of his face looked like the two smaller boys, pale and ghostly. I shuddered, and the whole kitchen went cold. I could literally see my breath, and I felt more terror from these three young boys than I've ever felt before for anything else. I know it seems crazy, but there was something about their voices and their near-identical clothing. It just wasn't normal. It was like they were trying to appear as normal and human as they could, but lacked the sense of identity and uniqueness that all humans have. As the older boy approached, I realized he was as tall as me, and he stood between the two haunting children. I stepped back. "Please, let us in. It's cold and dark and we're frightened." The taller boy said this with his voice weirdly still, but yet also young and childlike, but it didn't seem normal. I stepped a little further. "Come on, Connor. Let us in. We can't come in unless you say it's okay." My eyes widened in disbelief as I let out a gasp. I felt my whole body shiver with fear, and my heart threatened to stop beating. How could they know my name? This sort of stuff doesn't happen in real life, and hoping it was all some kind of hallucination or my imagination gone wild, I closed my eyes for a moment and hoped they would be gone. But when I opened my eyes again, they were still there. "Get out of here! I'm going to call the police!" I yelled, with my words not carrying any sort of strength. "They won't get here in time. You're in the middle of nowhere. You're all alone with us." The tallest boy cackled, as the two smaller boys giggled. Their hideous, giggling and heinous laughter sent fear rocketing through me. I could feel my eyes filling with tears, and terror filled me. They still kept laughing as they cackled and giggled, and I saw their teeth were as black as charcoal. "Go away. "Leave me alone," I cried out, but the boys suddenly stopped laughing and pushed up their faces against the glass on the door. I let out another gasp. Their eyes were black. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move, and I now knew these three phantoms were not children. Whatever these creatures were, with their eyes like midnight and their festering grins, were not human. And worse than that, they were thoroughly enjoying terrorizing me. "You're going to die in there," the smaller boy giggled. At that, I let out a yell and ran into the living room. I slammed the kitchen door shut and pushed one of the living room chairs up against it. I kept fearing that the simple wooden door would not keep them out, and staggered back towards the bedroom. But I could still hear them giggling and taunting me. I could feel my heart thumping, and the sense of fight or flight was taking hold. But I couldn't fight whatever those things were. And I couldn't run away either. Where would I go if I somehow escaped into the woods? I dreaded to think what else could be lurking out there. Or, what if I managed to get to the horse fields? Would I be safe with them? I doubted it. And what if I was outside and there were more than just three of them? As I wrestled with my chances and choices, I suddenly realized I couldn't hear them anymore. My eyes caught a glance of something pale, and I saw them standing on the other side of the living room window. Each of the three children stood in front of one of the large 3 windows, grinning at me. I wanted to run over and shut the blinds, but my feet wouldn't move, and when they finally did, I ran for the bathroom, the only room in the guest house with a lock, locking myself inside. I sat in the shower, lights off, hoping they would just leave me be. And as I lay there praying to every god, angel, demon, and deity I could think of, none of them answered my call or came to my aid. It was like the little boy said. I was alone, and I stayed there listening to the boys as they continued their chants of, let us in, Connor." It seemed like it would never end, until suddenly and abruptly it did. I couldn't hear any of them anymore, and after about half an hour of silence, I summoned up the courage I had left and peeked out the bathroom. The boys were gone from the living room window, so seeing my chance, I ran over and shut the blinds. Then I wondered if they were in the back or front door, so again I took a deep breath, pushed the chair aside and opened the kitchen door. They weren't there anymore, and the patio light was on again. They were gone. However, I took no relief from their disappearance, for even though I knew they were gone physically, I couldn't help feeling as though they were still lurking somewhere down in the garden path, watching me from the shadows, just waiting for me to let my guard down, to jump out and begin terrorizing me anew. For the rest of the night I sat up, with all the lights on and a big kitchen knife in my hand, waiting for my boyfriend to come back. When morning came and I heard the gates open, my eyes were heavy and I was exhausted. But that sound filled me with a wave of energy. I rushed over to the front door, unlocking it, and sprinted over to him in a frantic ramble. I tried to tell him what happened, and despite him saying he believed me, I could see in his eyes he didn't. I was on edge for the rest of my time there. I could sleep properly, and every time we were back on the fields or in the garden, I could sense something watching me. The following day nothing happened and the owners returned. I wanted to tell them what I had experienced, and they're good friends of ours, but I didn't want to freak them out or sound crazy, so I kept it to myself. As we had breakfast with them, one of the owners, Steph, told us how much of a good job we'd done, and asked if we had enjoyed it, to which we replied with a reluctant yes. Her mood changed, and her eyes looked worried as she asked us what were the problems. I assumed by problems she meant with the animals, and when I told her the animals were great, she looked at me and asked if someone tried to break in. I could feel what she was about to say before she could even say it, and I knew I didn't want to hear it. I would prefer my experience with those boys to be just a hallucination or the onset of madness, but I knew from the look in her eyes that she was going to tell us otherwise. Steph said the last few times they went on holiday, they would come home and find footage on their CCTV of 3 boys knocking at their door late at night and calling out for someone to let them in. They had the police search the grounds and the surrounding area, of course, but there was never any sign of a break-in. In truth, there was never any sign that the boys existed. I told her about my experience, and she seemed genuinely unnerved. And my boyfriend, who is as skeptical as they come, apologized for not believing me. They asked if we would ever house sit again for them, and without hesitation I respectfully declined. I never wanted to cross paths with those strange boys and their midnight eyes. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if it had not been me in the guest house but someone more trusting. I wonder what might have happened if I had have let them in. I imagine I wouldn't be here writing this account for you all. I don't know who or what they were or where they came from, but all I know is they weren't normal. They were real, and I'll never forget my visit from the black-eyed children. This happened about 7 years ago, and honestly, I still don't feel right talking about it. For some context, my boss, who also happens to be my stepdad, and I run a courier service here in the UK. We're used to long hours, overnight stops, and having to sleep in the van between jobs. Nothing about that part is unusual. But what happened in Bridgeport was. So we had just finished a late delivery, and decided to park up for the night in a small dark car park tucked away in a quiet village in Dorset. The place was secluded, no streetlights nearby, and no houses overlooking the lot. There was just trees and hedges. It seemed like the perfect place for getting a few hours of sleep before the early morning run. We did what we always do. Had a cigarette, drank some coffee, chatted for a bit, and then climbed into our bunks and settled in. The van was locked, curtains drawn, and everything felt normal. At around 3 a.m., I heard a tapping sound. It was coming from the passenger side window. I was half asleep and brushed it off, assuming it must be a tree branch or something scraping against the glass. I rolled over, pulled my blanket tighter, and tried to drift back off. Then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was followed by a voice. "Please, help. We're lost. Can you help us?" It sounded like a young girl of about 8 or 9, and that snapped me fully awake. My first thought wasn't fear, but concern. No child should be alone at that hour. Had they run away, especially in a place like this? Standing just outside the van was a young girl wearing a dark grey, almost black hoodie. Her head was tilted downwards and her face hidden in the hood. She looked small and fragile, like someone who genuinely would need help. "Please," she said, "can we use your phone? We're lost." But there was something wrong. The voice hadn't come from her. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was still half dreaming, and I turned to look at my stepdad. He was wide awake, sitting upright, staring out his window, completely frozen. Now, Trevor is the most skeptical person I know. He doesn't believe in ghosts, spirits, cryptids, anything paranormal at all. He's the kind of man who would need proof right in front of him, and even then might try and deny it. And in the years I've known him, I've never seen fear on his face. Until that moment. And that probably was the most alarming part, seeing this bloke scared. When I followed his gaze, I noticed there was another girl standing on his side of the van. She was the one who was speaking. "We need to use your phone," she said again. "Let us use your phone." I opened my mouth to ask Trevor why he hadn't answered her, but before I could say anything, he slowly shook his head without looking at me, his eyes never leaving the girl. I looked back at her and wished I hadn't. Her eyes were not eyes at all. They were black. No whites or pupils, no reflections, but the endless empty darkness. My stomach dropped. I turned back to the girl on my side of the van. She had lifted her head also, and her eyes were the same. But now, she was smiling, not in a friendly way, but like a predator. And the tapping grew louder and more insistent. "Let us use your phone," they repeated over and over. The tone had changed. They were no longer pleading, they were insisting. All of this happened within the space of about 90 seconds, but to me it felt like time had slowed down. As my heart rate increased and the fear flooded my body, time seemed to stretch. I tried to convince myself this wasn't real, that exhaustion was messing with my head, but the sound of knuckles on glass was unmistakable. And then the speaking girl whistled. The girl outside my window changed. She began pacing back and forth along the side of the van, jerking and twitching, making strange, almost animalistic sounds, and my blood at hearing this went ice cold. Just as I was about to shout for them to leave, both girls stopped at the same time in perfect synchronicity. They turned in unison and walked calmly away into the darkness, disappearing without another word. We didn't sleep after that. We left the car park soon after, as it was light enough to see the road, but neither of us were speaking much. Trevor hasn't tried to rationalize it, he hasn't joked about it, and coming from him, that says a lot. I know most people won't believe me, but I know what I saw, and I hope more than anything that I never see them again. Usually when you hear stories about black-eyed children knocking on doors, it's in some isolated farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, miles from anyone. That's one of the reasons I never thought I'd experience anything like this. I live in a normal suburban neighborhood, with the houses close together and neighbors on every side. Cars passing by at all hours. I believe in the paranormal, sure. But like most people, I never expected to come face to face with it. This happened earlier in the year around Thanksgiving of 2015, and like most holidays, the neighborhood was busy. Families were visiting, people were hosting dinners, and kids were running up and down the sidewalks, playing until dark. The sun had just finished dipping below the houses, leaving that dim orange-blue glow in the sky. Me? I was home alone, sitting on the couch with leftovers watching TV, and half paying attention to whatever was on, when I heard a knock at the door. I glanced at the wall clock. It was just before 7:30, not that late. Assuming it was a neighbor or some kids needing something, I didn't even bother looking through the peephole. I just got up and swung the door open, and there were two kids standing on my porch. The older one, a boy, was maybe 11, wearing a baseball cap, jeans, and a jersey. The second was smaller and younger, standing slightly behind him. He wasn't wearing a cap and kept his head tilted down, eyes fixed on the porch floor. I asked if they needed something, and the older boy smiled and said, "Yes, we just need to come in and get our baseball from your yard." The moment he spoke, a chill ran through me. It was instant and overwhelming. I hesitated, studying his face. Everything about him looked ordinary, but the longer I stared, the more unsettled I felt. There was something off, something that my mind couldn't quite identify. He noticed my pause and leaned slightly forward. "Come on, ma'am," he said in a voice firmer now. "We just want our ball back." That's when I realized what was wrong. His eyes. There were no whites, no pupils, but it was just solid black, filling the entire socket. For a split second I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some contact lenses or lighting or shadow. But then I looked at the younger boy, and he lifted his head just enough for me to see his eyes as well. The same dark void stared back at me. My heart slammed into my ribs. I must have reacted because the older boy's expression changed. His friendly smile twisted into something darker and sharper. His eyes seemed to gleam, and I swear he stood a little taller and more confident, like he knew exactly what I'd realized. The atmosphere changed. What had seemed like two harmless kids now suddenly felt like two things, wearing the shape of children, standing on my porch. The younger boy straightened up beside him. He looked different now as well, steadier and more self-assured, both of them staring directly at me and unblinking. Then after a long suffocating silence, the younger one spoke. "Come on, ma'am. Let us in." His voice was wrong, too calm. I wanted to scream. I wanted to slam the door and tell them to leave, to call them out for whatever they were. But fear kept me in place. What if provoking them made things worse? What if refusing outright meant they'd force their way in? Somehow I decided the safest option was to keep playing along. I forced a smile, nodded and said, "Yeah, I'll get it for you." Then I grabbed the door and slammed it shut. I locked it immediately, flipped on every light in the house and collapsed on the couch, pulled my knees up from my chest and rocked slightly, shaking uncontrollably as I listened. I couldn't hear footsteps or voices or laughter or any further knocking. And in a way, the silence was almost worse. Then came a slow knock at the door, and I froze. Another knock followed, measured and patient. I couldn't move. My arms were locked around my legs and my entire body was rigid with fear. The knocking continued for what felt like forever. The tapping lasted for about 2 minutes before it ceased completely. And the silence afterwards was unbearable. I stayed there all night, afraid to move and sleep. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but when I woke up it was around 2 a.m. and every light in the house was now off. The TV, which I knew I'd left on, was now filled with black and white hissing static, loudly in the darkness. That must have been what woke me. I don't know how to explain it, and I'm not sure what they were, but I do know that whatever knocked on my door that night wanted more than just to be let in. If anyone knows what these things are, I'd appreciate some insight. I'm usually pretty logical about things like this. I work nights, regularly go long stretches without sleep, and I'm well aware that exhaustion can mess with your perception. I've brushed off plenty of weird shadows and fleeting shapes over the years, as nothing more than my brain misfiring. But this isn't one of those moments. This happened in broad daylight with other people nearby, and that's the reason I can't really explain what I saw. Let's see what you make of it. I was doing HVAC work, repairing a condenser unit in a quiet, cookie-cutter suburban neighborhood. It was calm and bright and unremarkable. Directly across the street, a mother was in her driveway playing with her toddler. She was pushing him around in one of those little plastic ride-on cars, laughing, and everything about the scene felt ordinary and mundane. I finished up one task and started walking back towards my work van, which was parked around the side of the house. As I rounded the corner, I suddenly heard a shriek. It was the kind of sound that triggers your fight or flight response when you know something bad is happening. Without thinking, I picked up my pace and stepped fully into view of the house to see what was going on. My eyes immediately went to the mother across the street. She was still there, still pushing her kid around, completely unfazed. She hadn't reacted at all. That alone was unsettling. And then I heard the noise again. This time, it was now coming from the front of the house. I could pinpoint where it was coming from. My head snapped towards the house directly to the right of the one with the mother and child, and that was when I saw it. Standing near the front of that house was a small child staring directly at me. Its mouth was stretched wide open, frozen in the middle of that same awful shriek. But it wasn't the sound that stopped me cold, it was the eyes. They were completely black. Not dark brown, not shadowed. I'm talking solid black, the entire eye socket, no whites, no pupils. Just darkness. We locked eyes. I remember my brain desperately trying to rationalize it. Perhaps lighting, sunglasses. But none of that fit. I glanced back at the mother, absolutely certain she had to notice something was wrong, but she didn't even look up. She kept playing with her child as if nothing unusual was going on. And when I looked back, the thing waved at me. Not in a beckoning motion, a slow, deliberate wave. Like saying, "I know you're looking at me." That was enough for me. I slowly backed away, heart pounding, and returned to the condensing unit, crouching down beside it like I was hiding behind a cardboard box. I stayed there for 5 minutes, trying to calm down, convincing myself I hadn't just seen what I knew I had. When I finally worked up the nerve to step back around the corner, the child thing was gone. The mother was still there, acting completely normal, unaware that anything had ever happened at all. And the street looked exactly as it had before, pedestrian. I finished my work and left as quickly as I reasonably could. And when I got home, I told my girlfriend about what happened, still trying to downplay it even as I explained it. I hadn't even finished talking before she said, "That sounds like a black-eyed child." I'd never heard of them before. After she explained what they were supposed to be, I felt sick. Too many details lined up. I'm gonna be honest, I still am unsure of what I saw that day, but there was something deeply wrong about the entire encounter, and it hasn't left me feeling well since. I'm happy calling it a cryptid hallucination or whatever. I just hope never to see one again. This happened when I was in high school, sometime between 2000 and 2004. I remember the night vividly. I was woken up sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning by a soft but persistent knocking sound. At first I thought I was dreaming, and then I heard it again, knuckles tapping lightly against the glass. Along with it came the low, steady hum of an engine idling outside, barely audible, but unmistakable in the quiet of the night. My room was dark except for a faint glow coming from the streetlight leaking through the blinds. The house was completely silent otherwise. Everyone else was asleep. I remember lying there for a moment, heart pounding, trying to decide if I should even look. Eventually curiosity won out. I slid out of bed and walked over to the window. Carefully, I pulled one slat of the blinds aside, just enough to peek through. And right there, inches away, was a girl's face. I nearly jumped out of my skin. She was standing close enough that I could see the outline of her features even in the dim light. Her hair was pulled back tight into a ponytail, and she looked young, like a teenager. Even though the window was closed, her voice came through clearly, as if she was standing inside the room with me. "Is Nick home?" she asked. Nick, for context, is my brother. Because of that, my immediate reaction wasn't fear, it was more annoyance and confusion. My brother had a habit of coming home very late, sometimes not until the early hours of the morning, especially back then. I instantly assumed this was his girlfriend stopping by unannounced. Half asleep and not thinking straight, I told her I'd go check. I left my bedroom, walked down the short hallway to my brother's bedroom, and his door was closed. But the room was dark and empty. His bed hadn't been slept in. He wasn't home. That's when things should have started to feel weird, but they didn't yet. So I returned to my room and, feeling more confident now, raised the blinds completely. That's when I realized this girl was not my brother's girlfriend. His girlfriend was tall with long blonde hair, and this girl was much shorter with jet black hair pulled tight against her head. She was standing rigidly, hands at her sides, not shifting her weight or moving the way people normally do when they're waiting. Behind her, parked in our driveway, was a car. That explained the engine I'd heard idling. The headlights were off, but the vehicle was running. I told her again that Nick wasn't home. Her reaction was strange. Instead of thanking me or leaving immediately, she looked unsettled, almost anxious, and muttered under her breath, "Nick, where are you?" It didn't sound like frustration. It sounded flat and rehearsed. I repeated that he hadn't come home yet, and without looking at me, she turned and walked away towards the car. She didn't hurry, but didn't linger either. She slipped into the passenger seat, and moments later the car pulled away. That was weird. I closed the blinds, and went back to bed. But lying there in the dark, fully awake now, something began gnawing at me. I replayed the interaction over and over in my head, and that's when I realized something unsettling. I couldn't remember her eyes, not the color, not the shape, not even the reflection, and at the time I was speaking to her, it hadn't occurred to me at all. But now the absence felt glaring, as if my mind had slid right past them, like they weren't there to register in the first place. The next day, I told my brother about the girl. He looked genuinely confused and said his girlfriend had no idea who it could have been. That didn't entirely reassure me. He cheated on his girlfriend before, and I had always wondered if he was lying to cover something up, but even so, none of his explanations fit. I know I wasn't dreaming. I've never had dreams like that before. Years later, though, after learning about stories involving the black-eyed kids, the memory came back to me. And that's when things started clicking into place. All of it. The knocking, the insistence on someone specific, the strange emotional flatness, and most of all, those dark pits where the eyes should have been. But there's one more unsettling possibility I've never been able to shake as well. One of my brother's former girlfriends died in a horrific accident years ago. She was underneath a jacked-up mobile home, cleaning beneath it when it collapsed and crushed her. They were broken up at the time, but I wonder if what I saw that night wasn't a black-eyed kid at all, but her spirit, coming back to check on him one last time. I don't know what she was. I just know she wasn't normal, and I'm glad I never opened the window to find out. I was living in Nebraska at the time this happened. Me and my family had just moved from Texas the year before, so we were pretty new to the area. I was only 12 at the time, and this took place in the fall of 2004. We had moved to Red Willow, Nebraska, which is a tiny rural area compared to where we were from in Texas. It was an adjustment, but we were getting used to it. At the time, it was just me, my older sister, and our parents. We lived in a 3-bedroom house just off a quiet road, and I was a shy, lonely kid in my youth. I stayed to myself and didn't get into any trouble. I played my PlayStation 2 a lot and would stay in my room most of the time. Like I said, I was a loner and didn't really like to socialize with anyone. The night these events happened, I was at my home by myself. My dad was really good friends with the local sheriff, so he would sometimes go help him with odd jobs and stuff like that. My mum had a friend whose house she would go to a lot, and my sister was probably over at one of her friends' houses. I didn't mind being home alone one bit. I had just been playing my PlayStation 2 when I got up to go get some water. The house was quiet and everything was locked up. That was one thing about me. I always had to make sure everything was locked up if I was by myself. I went to the kitchen, but I started to get this weird feeling I couldn't explain. Something felt off, and I started to tremble a little. I thought to myself, why was this happening, but I figured I was just having some anxiety. I went and grabbed some water and poured it into a cup. The blinds were closed to the kitchen window, but I had a feeling to look out of them. I looked outside, and it was dark, except for a few streetlights in the distance. I just figured I was overreacting and I was about to head back to my room, but that's when a light knock came to the door. Now, from where the kitchen window was, I wouldn't have a view of the outside front door, so I slowly and cautiously walked over to the front door. There was a small window that I could peek out of. The blinds were shut with the curtain over them. I briefly looked outside to see who was there, and what I saw still haunts me. There were 2 kids outside with their heads down, and they were just looking at the floor. One appeared to be about 13 or 14, and the other one appeared to be about 8 or 9. They were both girls from what I could tell, and I thought to myself, what the hell are these kids doing here at this hour? Are they lost? I said I didn't want to open the door, but I felt guilty. What if they needed help and were lost or something? And at the same time, the whole thing was very suspicious. That's when I noticed the older girl kind of looked to her side. I knew she could see me. I could tell, but her face wasn't looking up at me. The kids had their heads down. I opened for them just a crack, and there was a moment of silence and first. I looked at both of them. Something just seemed so off about these kids. Why hadn't I seen them around? It was a small county where everyone knew everyone. Yes, I was a loner and everything, but the school I went to wasn't big, and it was kindergarten through to 12th grade, with maybe 100 kids and everyone knew everyone there. So who the hell were these kids? Where had they come from? That's when I decided to speak up. You two okay? You guys lost? At first, I was met with silence. But then, after the longest time, the elder spoke up. We are lost. Can we please come in and use your phone so we can call our mum? I'm not allowed to let you in, but I can bring you the phone so you can call whoever you need to. Cell phones weren't really a thing back then, but I did have a flip phone that I kept in touch with my parents and older sister with, and the older girl spoke up again. We're really cold and lost. We need to come in and use your phone. My parents don't allow me to let strangers in, but I can dial your parents' phone number and you can call them. Just pure silence after. What were these kids doing? They were acting so strange and I just don't know. Something about them was off. It's getting late. I'm gonna have to close the door. I can't let you guys in. But I'll dial the number for you guys so you can get out of the cold and get your way home. This was just too strange. I couldn't take it anymore. That's when they both sat up, looked at me. And when I say this is the scariest thing I've ever seen, I mean it. Both these girls' eyes were pitch black. They had no whites, just voids of darkness. I yelled in fear and slammed the door shut, quickly locking it and rushing off to my room. I slammed the door and grabbed my phone that was on my nightstand. I turned off the lights, hid under the covers, and could hear the knocking on the door but ignored it. I wanted to call my dad, but if I told him the situation, he wouldn't believe me and would think me crazy. So I stayed hidden under the covers, shaking and trembling from what was out there. Eventually, my mum and older sister came home. I rushed in and hugged my sister, who was shocked but hugged me tightly back. They could tell I was scared, but I refused to tell them what happened because I know no one would believe me and didn't want people to think I was crazy. It was years later when I heard about the stories of the black-eyed kids, and I realized that they must have been those mysterious kids who I'd encountered that night. I've since heard of many stories consisting of black-eyed kids, and I think to myself, that's what I saw that night. I'm glad I didn't let them in. Who knows if I'd even still be here to share this with all of you. My brothers and I were staying at my nan's house for the night, something that we had done plenty of times before. It was a quiet street where nothing really happened in a suburban neighborhood, and the whole house was dark and still. Sometime between 12:30 and 1 in the morning, the sound of knocking tore through the silence. Rapid and sharp, hard enough to rattle the door. Almost immediately the dog exploded into fits of barking. That alone was unusual. The dog was blind and normally calm, only reacting to voices or familiar sounds, but this time it was frantic, barking non-stop like it was cornered and upset. The knocking and barking combo managed to wake up everyone in the house. At first we assumed my nan wouldn't answer it. Who knocks on someone's door at that hour? But after a moment of hesitation we heard footsteps moving towards the front door. From upstairs, we could hear muffled voices, hers and someone else's, speaking quietly but urgently. The conversation went on longer than it should have. Then the door closed. We went downstairs to ask her what had happened, and when we saw her we knew instantly something had shaken her badly. She was pale and visibly trembling, one hand gripping the edge of the table as if she needed it to stay upright. She told us it had been a young boy no older than 16, standing alone on the doorstep. He was wearing a long black trench coat that looked far too heavy and formal for someone of his age. The street light behind him barely seemed to touch his face, as if the light slid off instead of landing. As soon as she opened the door, the dog lunged forward, barking uncontrollably, until the boy calmly held his hand out towards its face. The dog stopped instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. That terrified her. The dog couldn't see and it didn't respond to gestures but voices only, yet it went completely silent the moment the boy raised his hand. The boy then asked if he could come inside. He asked more than once, and each time my Nam refused, he repeated the request in the same flat, polite tone. When she asked where his parents were, he wouldn't answer. When she asked why he was out so late, he ignored the question entirely and just asked again to be let in. That's when she noticed his eyes. She said she hadn't seen them clearly at first, but when he tilted his head up to look directly at her, her stomach dropped. His eyes were completely black, empty voids staring straight back at her. She said it felt like he wasn't just looking at her but through her, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. She told us she suddenly felt confused, like her body wanted to step aside and let him in, even though every part of her mind was screaming not to. She described it as having to fight herself, having to physically force her hand to push the door closed. Closing that door, she said, took more effort than it should have. It was like pushing against invisible resistance. Once the door was finally shut and locked, she rushed to the front window to see where the boy had gone. But he wasn't anywhere to be seen. There was nowhere he could have hidden. The street was empty in both directions, no cars driving away, or footsteps fading into the distance. One moment he was there, the next, as if he'd never existed at all. My Nan didn't sleep well for the rest of the night. Neither did we. To this day, she refuses to talk about what she saw, but whenever the black-eyed kids are mentioned, her reaction says it all. This happened about 3 months ago. My girlfriend and I were driving together late at night, around 9 or 10 p.m. It was cold. We pulled into a small parking area near a supermarket to grab a few groceries. The lot wasn't completely empty, but it wasn't busy either, with just a few scattered cars under dim streetlights. Before either of us had time to unbuckle our seatbelts, a girl suddenly appeared next to the car. She couldn't have been older than 12. She had her hair in pigtails and was wearing a baby pink dress that felt completely out of place, not only for the time of night but the temperature too. At a first glance she looked harmless, but the moment we noticed her standing there, both of us felt it. Fear. The lighting was bad. For a second we couldn't tell what exactly was setting off that feeling, but then I looked closer at her face. Her eyes were completely black. No whites or pupils, just solid darkness filling the socket. Like someone had inked her eyes. The longer you looked, the worse it felt. Like your head was spinning slightly. Like you were being pulled towards her without moving. It was both hypnotic and terrifying at the same time. We were still in the car when she spoke. "Let me in. Take me home," she said calmly. Hearing that come from a child should have triggered sympathy, but instead it made every alarm in my body go off at once. I didn't respond. I immediately locked my door. My girlfriend, though, reacted differently. She looked drawn to her, not scared like I was, but distracted, almost dazed. She started telling me that maybe we should help her, and that she was just a kid and that it was late and cold. Her tone didn't sound like her at all. It was flat and detached, like she was repeating something instead of deciding it. And that's when the girl moved. She ran to my girlfriend's side of the car as I was reaching over to lock the door. The timing felt deliberate, and as soon as the lock clicked, the girl's demeanor changed completely. She started hammering her hands against the window hard. She yelled at us to let her in over and over, voice louder and more frantic now. The sound echoed through the parking lot, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't wait. I started the car and floored it, pulling out the parking lot without even checking properly. My girlfriend snapped out of whatever trance she'd been in that moment, and she started crying and asking what happened. As we drove away, I looked in the mirror. The girl was already walking towards another car that had just parked like nothing had happened. We didn't stop. We didn't warn anyone. We just went home and locked all the doors and windows and tried to calm down. Neither of us slept much that night. Later, when we finally searched online, we found another story describing the exact same thing. A meeting with black-eyed children. The same eyes, the same request to be let in. I'm just gonna say this once. If a child with black eyes ever approaches you, don't engage or argue, just run and don't look back. This story happened to my ex and I. Picture the scene. A spot, quiet and tucked away from the main road, next to a lake, with the water stretching out beside us in an old lane running past the mill. No prizes for guessing what my ex and I were doing there at that time. But then we noticed movement. A kid walked past the front of the car, close enough that my headlights briefly caught him in their glow. At first, I barely registered him, just assumed he was cutting through the area, but then he slowed down near my front tire, crouched slightly, with his hand moving in a way that made my stomach drop. It looked like he was trying to slash the tire. Instantly, I was furious. I threw the door open and stepped out without thinking. I'm 6'5", and when I get out of a car looking angry, people, especially kids, either freeze or bolt, and I was fully expecting him to panic and run. But he didn't. He stood there and stared up at me, not defiant or scared, but with empty eyes. The moment our eyes met, something felt wrong. There was no recognition or reaction, just this flat, unreadable gaze. Kids didn't behave like this. It was like he wasn't even looking at me, but more looking through me. I told him to leave. My voice was sharp, loud enough to echo faintly across the water. "Go on, get out of here," I tell him. But he didn't respond. He simply turned, unnaturally stiff, and walked up the narrow lane beside the lake. The lane ran past the old school building, thick stone walls, and no windows facing the path. I followed a few steps behind, more to make sure he was actually leaving than anything else. I reached the edge of the path and stopped. The kid was gone. He hadn't ducked behind anything, he hadn't run, but he'd disappeared. It had taken maybe 5 seconds. The lane was completely exposed. On one side was the lake, fenced off with a 6-foot metal railing, and on the other side was the solid stone wall of the school. There were no trees, or bushes, or anywhere to hide. There were no sounds of footsteps, no splashing, nothing. It's like he'd just been erased, deleted from our reality. I stood there longer than I want to admit, scanning the lane, the fence, the water, trying to force logic into a situation that refused to accept it. Eventually, I went back to the car. My girlfriend was pale. She asked if I'd noticed how young the kid looked. I told her I thought that was the least strange part, and she said something that made my stomach clench. He didn't look right. His pupils were massive. I couldn't even see the white of his eyes. That's when it clicked. That blank stare, the way his gaze went straight through me, instead of landing on me. His eyes hadn't been dilated. They were black, solid black. I still don't know what that thing was. I've had experiences with spirits before, and this didn't feel like that. There was no heavy atmosphere, no sudden dread. I didn't feel threatened, just deeply unsettled. Could it have been a demon? Some kind of poltergeist manifestation, perhaps? I honestly don't know. I've never dealt with anything like that before. What makes it harder to ignore is the location. The school beside the lane had originally been a watermill back in the 1800s. Several children had died there over the years. The lake itself has a grim reputation, suicides, drownings, bodies pulled from the water long after anyone remembered their names. And behind the lake were woods, where according to local stories at least one murder had taken place. Looking back, it was a terrible place to park. I've never been afraid of the paranormal. I've always respected it and kept my distance, and understood that some things aren't meant to be understood. But that night was truly the first time I felt disturbed. I've heard about black-eyed kids plenty of times before, and honestly, they didn't terrify me the way they seem to scare other people. I'd done paranormal investigations before, and was used to dark buildings, strange sounds, and trying to rule things out logically. But still, the idea of the black-eyed kids always left me with a faint sense of unease. One day at work, a co-worker and I were talking about paranormal topics. He was a pretty gullible guy and already uneasy about the stories I'd told him in the past, so I decided to mess with him a little. I brought up the black-eyed kids and told him that even talking about them could draw their attention. I said that if I explained more, he might get noticed, and he had to agree before I continued. He laughed, but agreed. I told him what the black-eyed kids were, shared a few stories I'd read, then exaggerated it on purpose. I ended it with, "Now that you know about them, you'll probably get a visit within 3 days." He brushed it off, though I could tell it stuck with him. 2 days passed, and on the 3rd day I reminded him. He'd forgotten about it, and we joked, making dumb ghost noises and laughing it off. That night I went home, did some chores and went upstairs to exercise. I was walking on my treadmill, binge-watching Friends on Netflix. The episode was almost over when the screen suddenly faded to black. I assumed it was a power issue or a glitch, until I heard a child's giggle. The giggle twisted into something darker, and on the screen appeared a close-up image of a red-haired, freckled-faced kid of maybe 10. The image was tilted slightly, like someone had cocked their head while staring straight at me. Its eyes were completely black. The laughing continued. I jumped off the treadmill and froze, staring at the screen, my mouth hanging open. The image didn't move, it stayed there. And after a few moments the laughter faded, the image vanished, and Friends resumed right as it had left off. End credits rolling as if nothing had happened. The entire thing lasted maybe 30 seconds. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the sound of the laughter in my head over and over. What unsettled me the most was the timing. I joked about a visit and somehow I was the one who got it, but just not in the way I expected. When I told my coworker the next day, he assumed I was lying to scare him, and I couldn't blame him. I spent hours online researching for an image that matched the one I'd seen, but I couldn't find one. Eventually, I tried recreating it myself, even though my Photoshop skills are basic at best. The image I made is as close as I can get to what appeared on my TV that night. I don't know what it was, but I stopped joking about the black-eyed kids after that. I was 19 when this happened. We were living in Chicago, in the McKinley Park neighborhood, renting a 2-story house with a finished basement. At the time, the other tenants were family members, so the place always felt busy. Voices, movement, doors opening and closing. But that night was different. My aunt was 9 months pregnant, and earlier that day her water broke. Everyone scrambled. There wasn't enough room in the 2 cars, and since the hospital was only about 15 minutes away, I volunteered to stay behind. I figured I'd just be alone for a bit, until they came back with updates. For the first time in a long time, I had the entire house to myself. The house layout was odd. The staircase that led from the first floor down to the basement was a narrow, winding set of old wooden steps tucked right into the kitchen. At the bottom of those stairs, if you turned right, you immediately hit a small laundry room and a half bathroom beside it. Straight ahead, down a narrow corridor, was my uncle's basement bedroom, and beyond that was a large recreation room. An open space with a minibar, a pool table, some free weights, and a small cot pushed up against one wall. As soon as the cars pulled away, I headed downstairs to work. I'd done it countless times before and never had a problem. I loaded the weights onto the bench press, laid back and started my routine, 10 reps per set. I knocked out 3 sets without incident until I heard a creak. It wasn't a random pop or a house settling noise. The distinct, rhythmic creak of someone stepping onto the old staircase from the kitchen above. Those steps had a sound you learn to recognize after living there long enough. Without thinking, I called out my sister's name but didn't get a reply. I paused, listening. The house went dead silent, and after a few seconds I told myself it was the building shifting, and laid back down to continue. Halfway through the next set I heard it again. This time there was no mistaking it. Someone was coming down the stairs. I racked the weights and stood up. I wasn't panicking yet, but I was definitely alert. I walked towards the bottom landing of the staircase and slowly started climbing, each step creaking under my weight. I remember being very aware of my size in that moment. 5'7", about 150 pounds. I was strong and athletic, but that didn't stop the unease from creeping in. I reached the first floor and methodically checked every room. No one was there, no signs of a break-in, doors locked, windows untouched. Before heading back upstairs, I decided to check the basement rooms again. Everything except my uncle's bedroom. That door was always locked. But when I came back downstairs, the door was wide open. That alone sent a cold wave through me. The bedroom was never unlocked, and what I saw inside made my stomach drop. The room was completely empty. No bed, nightstand, TV, closet furniture, just bare walls and an open space. And standing in the center of the room was a little girl. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. She looked exactly like my sister, except younger, around 11, with long bangs framing her face. But it was impossible. My sister was 2 years older than me. She was 21. Then I saw her eyes. There were no whites, just solid darkness staring out at me. The air felt heavy like I was underwater, and my entire body broke out in chills. She smiled, in a way that felt calm, knowing, familiar, and sinister, all at the same time. I ran. I bolted out the room, slammed the door shut behind me, turned off every light, and sprinted up the second floor and stayed there until my family came back from the hospital. I never told them what I saw. My stepmother was a witch, not metaphorically but literally, and she practiced occult traditions openly. I'd always hated being in that house and always felt watched there, but it was where the weight set was, so I put up with it. After that, I never went back into the basement alone. I don't believe in ghosts in the traditional sense, not ghouls or apparitions or wandering spirits, but I know what I saw. Whatever that thing was, wasn't human, and it wasn't very good at pretending to be so. Eventually we moved into our own place, and since then, nothing has happened like that, and I'm grateful for it. I'm a 911 operator, and out of all the calls I've taken over the years, there's one that still sticks with me. Not because of violence or bloodshed, but because of how wrong it felt from the moment the line opened. The call came in late at night, well past midnight. The woman on the line was hysterical and barely able to breathe between her sentences. She reported a home invasion in progress. According to her, 2 men had entered her apartment while she was sleeping. She admitted right away that she had forgotten to lock the door. She described them clearly at first. One was tall and unnaturally thin, holding a wrench. The other was short, heavy-set and carrying a hammer. They'd woken her by banging on the walls in her living room. When she came out to see what was happening, they calmly told her they were maintenance workers responding to a call about her air conditioning. She insisted she hadn't made a call and demanded they leave at once. And that's when things stopped making sense. Instead of exiting, the men moved past her and dove behind the furniture in her living room. One slipped behind the couch, the other behind a high-backed armchair. They didn't run. They didn't hide like people trying to escape. They just settled in. As I stayed on the line with her, dispatching officers and relaying updates, she kept screaming at them to leave over and over, her voice crackling as she told them the police were on their way. She was begging, pleading and shouting again, but the men never responded. What unnerved me the most was how her descriptions changed. She stopped talking about tools, stopped talking about clothing. All she could describe were fragments, bald head, slowly rising into view just enough to be seen, the sound of their breathing, raspy and wet. She kept repeating it, their eyes were too big and completely black with no whites. She said they tracked her movement around the room without turning their heads like insects. About 5 minutes into the call, her tone shifted. She went quiet and whispered that she couldn't see them anymore. But they hadn't run or moved towards the door. They'd simply ducked behind the furniture and vanished from sight. She told me she was going to look for them. I instructed her firmly not to move, to stay where she was. Moments later, I heard knocking through the phone, law enforcement announcing themselves, and then, strangely, I heard a dog barking through my headset. That detail bothered me immediately. In true home invasion scenarios, if there's a dog present, you hear it early, panicked, non-stopped barking. But this barking only began after the officers entered the apartment. I muted my mic and stayed on the line as officers cleared the residence room by room. The woman kept insisting the men were still there, telling officers they had sunk down into the shadows on the floor, like they always did when they were about to be caught. After a full sweep, the officers found no intruders. They concluded that in her panic, she had mistaken the furniture for people. The love seat for a short man, the high-back chair for a tall one, a stress-induced hallucination. Fair response. Case closed. The residence is now flagged. But I'll never forget the way she described those men. Not once did she hesitate while talking about their eyes, nor did the story contradict itself. And I've never been able to explain how she knew exactly where they were watching her from, or why she was so certain they hadn't left, only gone down. I've taken thousands of calls, but that one has stuck with me. This story begins in the late 90s, sometime around 99 I think. A childhood acquaintance of mine wanted to introduce me to a friend of his from work. At the time, we were both in our late teens or early 20s, while the guy he introduced me to was clearly older, probably mid-30s. The man had a very specific presence. He drove a classic car with dark tinted windows and dressed in a deliberately retro style, like he was leaning into a certain aesthetic. I remember thinking he stood out in a way that felt intentional, like he enjoyed being noticed. Somehow, within an hour of meeting him, the conversation took a strange turn. Without much build-up, he pulled out a small glass vial filled with liquid. Inside were 2 black discs suspended in the fluid. He explained they were full eye contact lenses and demonstrated by putting them in. They didn't just cover the iris, they completely covered the whites of his eyes as well, turning them completely black. It was unsettling to see in person, even if he seemed casual about it. He told me he'd had them custom made for around $400, which was a lot of money back then. I remember asking him, honestly confused, why? His answer was simple and oddly dismissive. For fun. At the time, it was well before anyone talked about the black-eyed kids, so I didn't attach any deeper meaning to it. I just filed it away as something strange and moved on. Fast forward to nearly a decade later, I think it was early 2009. I was heading out for a night in the city about an hour away. Before getting on the freeway, I stopped at a gas station roughly 40 minutes from my destination. It was around 9 p.m, fully dark outside, and I went in to grab a Red Bull. And that's when I noticed a woman standing one aisle over. She was wearing a black leather jacket and had short blonde hair cut to her jawline. I guessed she was either mid-30s or early 40s. I wasn't paying much attention until I heard her ask the cashier, "Is Scoville north or south from here?" The town she mentioned was extremely well known and nowhere near the gas station. It immediately struck me as an odd question. Why would someone be traveling and not know the basic direction of a major town over 100 miles away? Then she turned and looked directly at me. Her eyes were completely black. Not a dark brown, entirely black, including the whites. The sight stopped me cold. For a moment I genuinely didn't know how to react. I only remember thinking, oh my. Then my mind stalled. A few seconds later I convinced myself not to make a scene, paid for my drink and left. I tried to brush it off as someone wearing contacts, even though something about that felt deeply unsettling. The rest of the night was mostly normal. I met up with people, went out, nothing unusual stood out, and it wasn't until I was driving home that things escalated. The freeway was nearly empty, and a large, heavy-duty pickup truck began following me too closely. I was already 2/3 of the way home, when suddenly I was hit with an overwhelming white light. It wasn't like headlights, there was no direction to it, it didn't cast shadow. It just filled everything, like a luminous fog. Next thing I knew, I was still driving, but the truck was gone. I glanced to the lane on my left, and saw a girl pressed against her window, her face and both hands flattened directly against the glass, staring at me. At the time, I dismissed it as someone being strange or trying to get a reaction, and I kept driving until I got home. That's when I noticed the time. 2 hours were missing. Since that night, I've noticed a disturbing pattern. From time to time, I encounter women with shoulder-length blonde hair who seem to appear repeatedly in my life, almost like they're watching or following me. When this happens, it's often followed by something intensely strange or overtly paranormal. I don't believe it's the same woman each time, but they all share the same generic appearance. And by black eyes, I mean entire eye including the sclera, completely black. I don't know if this means anything, but looking back, it's hard not to connect the dots. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed our return with Black-Eyed Kids stories. I hadn't actually done this topic in over a year, and I really love the stories. Such good fun reading them. The first story, in fact, was one of my first ever submissions 9 years ago now. My wife and I were house-sitting for a friend, and I remember receiving that. And even though we were house-sitting in Plaster in London, the fact that, it was just us alone, I could relate a bit more to this story because we were doing something similar at that very moment. But I love this story. I love the topic. I love bringing it back. I feel like the stories, are kind of forgotten about, or people just don't see them or publish them anymore. But I really have fun with this one. If you'd like to hear more in future, let me know and I'll try and find more. That being said, the Reddit Black-Eyed Kids subreddit has been locked and they don't give me access, at least not at the time of recording, so I hope they do so that I can revisit the topic again in future perhaps. I would like to give one final thank you to my members and patrons whose names you can see on the screen right now. If you'd like to receive some cool perks, you can follow me over there for more. But that's it from me. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.